The sound of a controlled explosion in Oslo on Saturday night as a suspected bomb was destroyed. A 17-year-old Russian who's lived in the country for several years and had applied for asylum was taken into custody as a suspect.
Refugees from the Middle East seeking asylum in Norway have been braving the cold temperatures of the Russian Arctic to reach Europe. Exhausted and lacking money, many are using bicycles.
In my home country, women just sit at home, make food and clean the house and stuff like that. They only do work at home. I have to decide for the women. That was what I thought when I first came to Norway.
A new study finds the vast majority of violent crime in Oslo, Norway is committed by migrants and asylum seekers.
This is Norway, a country of over 5.6 million people and one of the richest on Earth. It's a nation built on oil wealth and humanitarian ideals that for decades opened its doors to refugees while other countries hesitated. But that Norway is gone. In late 2015, thousands of asylum seekers discovered a bizarre loophole at Norway's Arctic border with Russia. You couldn't walk across, Russia banned that. You couldn't be driven, Norway made that illegal. But bicycles? Bicycles were allowed. So they cycled through sub-zero temperatures across one of the most remote borders on Earth. 5,000 people made the journey, pedaling into what they hoped would be a sanctuary. Norway's response shocked the world. Police collected every abandoned bicycle at the border. The plan? Hand them back to the refugees and send them biking back to Russia through the Arctic in winter. That image, desperate people forced to reverse their journey on children's bikes through frozen wilderness, wasn't an isolated incident. It was a declaration. But that was just the start. Forced DNA tests followed, leading to mass revocations. Hundreds lost their residency permits. Some even lost their Norwegian citizenship. The government launched one of Europe's most aggressive deportation campaigns, a 40% spike in removals in a single year, with targets of nearly 7,000 expulsions. And when human rights groups condemned Norway for sending people back to Afghanistan, a country still engulfed in war, Immigration Minister Sylvi Listhaug delivered a response that made international headlines. I don't give a damn. This is the right thing to do. This isn't a far-right party operating on the margins. This is a government policy, mainstream consensus, bipartisan agreement. So what happened? How did Norway, a country that prided itself on being a humanitarian beacon, transform into one of Europe's hardest lines on immigration? Today, on Across the Globe, we're breaking down Norway's shocking transformation, the crisis that changed everything, the policies that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, and whether Norway is becoming the next Denmark. So to grasp Norway's transformation, you need to understand what it was before, because it definitely wasn't always like this. For most of the 20th century, Norway's approach to immigration, again, was guided by humanitarian ideals and oil wealth. The country had resources to spare and a commitment to helping refugees. Immigration remained relatively limited, but Norway took pride in welcoming people fleeing conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East, and Africa. The philosophy was simple: bounded universalism. Everyone who entered Norway would have equal access to the country's strong welfare benefits and services. There was an assumption that newcomers would do their part: work, integrate, learn Norwegian, and in return, they'd enjoy full rights as residents. By 2024, 20.8% of Norway's residents were immigrants or children of immigrants. That's a wild demographic shift from what had been one of Europe's most homogenous societies. But throughout the 1990s and 2000s, there was little public concern. Immigration wasn't politicized. Norway's arms were open. Its social safety net extended to everyone. The country was confident its social model could absorb newcomers. That confidence was about to shatter. The turning point was 2011, but not in the way you'd expect. In July 2011, a far-right extremist named Anders Behring Breivik carried out Norway's worst peacetime atrocity. He bombed government buildings in Oslo, claiming the lives of 8 people. After that, he went to a youth camp on Utøya Island, where he systematically took out an additional 69 people, the majority of them being teenagers. Warnings about the Islamization of Europe and anti-immigration rhetoric overflowed in his manifesto. Norway was horrified. The entire nation mourned. Politicians from all parties condemned Breivik's ideology. However, there was a crack under the surface. The massacre demonstrated how immigration anxiety, which was previously thought to be minor, had developed into something much more intense and sinister. Public discourse intensified. It was now charged. Questions that were previously taboo now felt urgent. Then came the political earthquake of 2013. Elections brought in a center-right government that included the Progress Party, a populist, immigration-skeptical party that had been gaining ground for years. For the first time, Norway had a government willing to take a harder line. The shift was immediate. By early 2014, Norway was deporting foreigners at record rates. In just the first few months of 2014, over 1,160 people were forcibly removed, a 40% increase from the previous year. The target for the full year, 6,700 deportations. The Progress Party's Justice Minister Anders Anundsen reinforced the approach by saying, "If you're not allowed to stay, you must leave the country quickly." Deterrence was the message. Quick removals would deter future visitors and may even encourage voluntary returns. But this was still just the beginning. The real crisis was about to hit, and hit hard.
We know it's really dangerous. We've seen this in smaller scale many times, but you're never prepared to see things like this,
2015 was the watershed moment. War and chaos across the Middle East triggered the largest refugee movement since World War II. Over 1 million people fled to Europe that year, from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Eritrea. The images were everywhere. Overcrowded boats crossing the Mediterranean, families trekking through the Balkans, desperate people clinging to the undercarriages of trucks. Even Norway, far north, isolated and cold, felt the surge. In 2015 alone, 31,000 asylum seekers arrived in Norway. To put that in perspective, Norway typically received around 10,000 applications per year. This was triple that. For a country of 5 million people, it was overwhelming. Reception centers filled beyond capacity. Small towns suddenly had refugee facilities appear overnight. Local municipalities were stretched thin, scrambling to provide housing, healthcare, education, and social services to thousands of new arrivals. Many of these refugees had limited education, no Norwegian language skills, and came from cultures very different from Norway's non-religious, everybody is equal society. Unlike the structured guest worker programs of past decades, there was no integration plan at this scale. The system simply wasn't built for it. And then came the Arctic bicycle crisis we started with. Norway shares a remote border with Russia at Storskog in the far north. Russia had long forbidden pedestrians from crossing, and Norway had made it illegal for drivers to transport undocumented migrants. But bikes? Nobody had thought to regulate bikes. Word spread among refugee communities. By fall 2015, asylum seekers, mostly Syrians, began arriving at the Russian side of the border with cheap bicycles. They'd cycle across the frozen border into Norway, abandon their bikes, and claim asylum. Over 5,500 people made this journey in late 2015 alone. The images were surreal. Piles of abandoned bicycles at a remote Arctic checkpoint. It became an international story, a symbol of Europe's chaotic response to the crisis. But it also became a symbol of something else. Norway's feeling that it had lost control of its borders. Parliament responded with emergency legislation, passed with rare bipartisan support, tightening asylum rules across the board. On December 16, 2015, Sylvi Listhaug was appointed as Norway's first ever Minister of Immigration and Integration. Her mandate was simple: stop the flow. And she delivered. By January 2016, Listhaug announced that anyone who crossed at Storskog without proper documentation would be sent back to Russia. No asylum claim, no appeal, just deportation. And here's where it gets truly bizarre. Norwegian police collected all those abandoned bicycles at the border. The plan was to hand them back to the refugees for their return journey, force them to pedal back across the Arctic to Russia. When a police official was asked about this policy, he admitted it feels a bit awkward and odd. After public outcry, authorities promised to bus people out instead, but the message was sent. Norway was no longer a pushover. What followed was one of the most intense policy shifts in modern European immigration history. Within months, Norway went from one of Europe's more welcoming countries to one of its strictest. So, let's break down exactly what the country did. Border controls during crisis. In June 2016, Parliament passed legislation authorizing border officials to refuse entry to asylum seekers during their extraordinarily high influx. If another refugee crisis hits, Norway can simply shut it its frontier, even to people coming from fellow Nordic countries. This was a deep exit from earlier practices, where anyone physically present in Norway had the right to claim asylum. Accelerated deportations. The window for appealing a rejected asylum claim was slashed from 3 weeks to just 1 week. This fast-track system left people almost no time to gather evidence or mount a legal challenge. The goal was clear as day: remove rejected applicants before they could establish roots. Safe third country transfers. Norway modified its Immigration Act to allow deportation to safe third countries, even if those countries wouldn't actually process asylum claims. Previously, Norway could only transfer someone to a country that would examine their case. That safeguard was deleted. The result? Norway began sending asylum seekers back to Russia, regardless of whether Russia would grant them protection. Despite pushbacks from the UN Refugee Agency, who warned that Norway is wrong to regard Russia as a safe country for refugees, Norway drove forward anyway. Temporary protection, permanent insecurity. Norway shifted toward temporary protection permits with the explicit goal of revoking them once countries of origin stabilized. Since 2017, Norwegian authorities have systematically reviewed and revoked hundreds of refugees' residency permits. The primary targets? Somalis. Nearly 1,000 Somalis and their family members lost their Norwegian residence permits in just a few years. The government argued that parts of Somalia were now safe enough to return. Syrian refugees have also been targeted as Damascus-controlled areas are deemed stable. The idea? Asylum is temporary, not permanent. Don't go getting comfortable. Slashing family reunification rights. New rules made it way harder for refugees to bring over family members. If officials believe a refugee's family could live safer in a third country where they have stronger ties than in Norway, they can deny reunification. This obscure clause has forced families to remain separated. Income and housing requirements also became stricter. Refugees must now prove they can financially support family members and have adequate housing before bringing them to Norway. Welfare benefits reduced. In a drastic break from tradition, Norway introduced waiting periods for refugees to access certain welfare programs and cut some social support entitlements. This violated the principle of equal treatment that had dominated Norway's system for decades. Politicians argued that generous benefits acted like a pull factor, attracting economic migrants rather than genuine refugees. The solution? Make Norway less attractive. Higher bars for permanent residence. By 2021, new rules required at least 3 years of full-time work or education in Norway, plus Norwegian language proficiency tests before immigrants could qualify for permanent residence. Previously, the criteria had been a lot more lenient. Obtaining citizenship now demands even stricter ID verification, advanced language skills, proof of self-sufficiency, and clean financial records. No debts, no unpaid fines, no criminal history. In short, Norway raised every hurdle for immigrants trying to build permanent lives. Deportation blitz. Throughout this period, deportations hit record highs. Police were given performance targets. Immigration enforcement became a priority, and Norway didn't shy away from controversial deportations. It became one of Europe's top countries sending Afghan asylum seekers back to Afghanistan, despite ongoing violence there. In 2016, only Germany, Greece, Sweden, and the UK returned more Afghans than Norway. For a small country of 5 million, that's absurd. When criticized, Listhaug didn't back down, she pressed harder. Beyond the policy shifts, Norway's immigration story is filled with scandals and bizarre episodes that show just how serious the transformation has been. Starting in 1999, Norwegian immigration authorities began DNA testing Somali migrants who applied to bring over family members. And the results were insane. Up to 25% were lying about family relationships. Then in 2010, Norway extended DNA tests to Somali couples claiming to be married but without children. The results were even more wild. 40% of these husbands and wives were actually siblings posing as married in order to take advantage of family reunion regulations. The government was then forced to extend DNA testing to other immigrant groups after the news sent shockwaves through the system. But investigations in 2015 uncovered additional fraud. Some Somalis in Norway had been residing in safe nearby nations like Ethiopia or Kenya before pretending to be refugees escaping the civil war in Somalia. Norway's response was, as you'd guess, unforgiving. Countless individuals, and even their Norwegian-born children, lost their citizenship for the deception. In April 2017, Immigration Minister Sylvie Listhaug traveled to Stockholm and claimed that parallel societies have developed in more than 60 places in Sweden, describing them as no-go zones, where criminals are in control. Sweden's government was furious. The Swedish migration minister even canceled meetings with Listhaug and called her statements complete nonsense. Even Norway's own prime minister gently scolded her to stick to facts. But the message was out there in the open. Norway was using Sweden as a cautionary tale. "Don't let Norway become Sweden" became an implicit campaign slogan for anti-immigration, with politicians pointing across the border as proof that generous immigration policies lead to crime, segregation, and social breakdown.
The convictions were over deadly assaults involving knife attacks and beatings, and many have left the victims permanently injured.
Then comes the crime statistics that fueled the fire. While Norway hasn't experienced the gang violence seen in Sweden, crime statistics have undoubtedly fueled public anxiety. A comprehensive study by Statistics Norway found that Somali-born residents had a criminal charge rate roughly double that of native Norwegians, approximately 124 per 1,000 Somalis versus 45 per 1,000 natives over a 4-year period. Even after adjusting for age and gender, the Somali rate stayed around 89 per 1,000, nearly twice the native average. Other immigrant groups showed elevated rates as well. The Progress Party successfully pressured the government to release previously withheld ethnic crime statistics. One figure stood out. Nearly half of young Somali Norwegian men in Oslo had been investigated for violent offenses in recent years. These statistics are subject to interpretation, but they've been weaponized politically. The narrative that immigration threatens law and order gained mainstream traction.
We feel that a very important part of running a reception center is to build a bridge between the residents and the local municipality, the local community.
Even though Norway took steps to prevent crime, like a no means no class to teach migrants about consent and avoid violence against women, this in many ways only made natives more fearful. Now, under the policy debates and statistics lies a deeper question. Can Norway maintain its national identity in the middle of rapid demographic change? Reportedly, 33 to 34% of Oslo's population had an immigrant background by 2022. Certain neighborhoods in East Oslo became minority majority, populated largely by immigrants from Pakistan, Somalia, Poland, and Iraq. While many people are happy with this diversity, others are cautious and concerned about ghettoization. In order to control the ethnic composition of neighborhoods, the Conservative Party's 2025 platform even suggests prohibiting asylum applicants from relocating to places where immigrants already make up more than 25% of the population. And the housing crisis only adds further fuel to the fire. A surge in population has driven up rents and home prices like crazy. Over half of immigrant renters in urban areas like Oslo and Viken spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Many Norwegians struggling to find affordable homes point to refugees being given municipal apartments, which causes resentment. This creates a toxic dynamic where natives and immigrants compete for housing that's stretched thin, with each group seriously believing that the other is getting unfair advantages. Then there's the welfare dependency concerns. Despite generous integration programs, many refugees struggle to find work in Norway's high-skilled economy due to factors like low formal education, implicit biases in hiring, occupational segregation, and difficulty in translating foreign qualifications. Unemployment rates among immigrants are significantly higher than those among natives. Unemployment rates among immigrants are significantly higher than among natives, and some remain on public assistance long term. This has fostered a narrative of welfare state strain, the notion that the system incentivizes dependency rather than integration. To that, critics argue Norway is creating subsidized isolation, where immigrants live in ethnic enclaves supported by benefits rather than employment. The government has responded by mandating participation in Norwegian language classes and work-oriented activities. But gaps are still there, and the worry that the welfare system is unsustainable continues to grow. Norway has also had problems with integrating different cultures. Debates have erupted over the way Muslim women dress. Norway banned face-covering veils in schools and universities in 2018. Also, refusals by some Muslim men to shake hands with women, and the role of religious practices in public life. Violent altercations have come up from aggressive Quran burnings by the far-right organization SIAN, Stop Islamization of Norway, in immigrant neighborhoods. So, with all of this considered, and what we've seen in Denmark with their immigrant crackdown, of course, people are comparing the two nations and asking themselves, is Norway becoming the next Denmark? Well, Denmark has gone further than any European country in restricting immigration, confiscating jewelry from refugees at the border, forcing asylum seekers onto temporary permits, setting ghetto quotas, and pursuing offshore asylum processing in Africa. So the question really is Norway following Denmark's playbook? The answer is yes, absolutely, but with some caveats. Like Denmark's 2019 paradigm shift, Norway now treats asylum as temporary, routinely revoking protection permits once origin countries are deemed safe. Both countries have wildly tightened family reunification rules. Denmark's ghetto plan limits the percentage of non-Western residents in certain areas. As we mentioned, Norway's Conservative Party now proposes avoiding refugee settlement in areas over 25% immigrant. Clear Danish inspiration. Most noticeably, former Prime Minister Erna Solberg stated a conservative government would send asylum seekers to third countries for processing. Exactly Denmark's model. The Conservatives also want to slash Norway's UN refugee quota, mirroring Denmark's cuts. The main difference? Tone. Denmark pursues zero asylum seekers as policy, and it's clear-cut and intense. Norway's rhetoric has been softer, but when ministers say they don't give a damn about criticism or warn immigration could make Norway a different country, the gap is closing quick. In a nutshell, Norway's transformation from humanitarian haven to immigration fortress happened with blazing speed. A combination of external shocks, the 2011 terror attack, the 2015 refugee crisis, and internal pressures, welfare concerns, crime statistics, cultural anxiety, created the perfect conditions for a political earthquake. Where Norway once prided itself on equal treatment and open doors, it now emphasizes integration requirements, deportation targets, and preserving Norwegian values. The country that readily gave shelter to refugees now makes newcomers earn their place, and signals that many won't get to stay at all. It may not appear as hardline as other countries, but it seems that behind closed doors, its plans and methods are just as tough, and they could get tougher. Operating in such a way, this shift has gone somewhat underreported internationally, overshadowed by Denmark's more intense measures. But as we've seen, Norway has been implementing its own restrictionist revolution, marked by bipartisan consensus on tough policies, the bicycle deportations, the DNA scandals revealing fake families, the citizenship revocations, the record deportations to Afghanistan, the "I don't give a damn" from government ministers. These aren't fringe positions. They're mainstream Norwegian policy. For a country famous for the Nobel Peace Prize and international selflessness, it's a serious reversal. But Norway's leaders argue they're being realistic, not cruel. They're protecting the welfare state that makes Norway special. They're preventing the social problems they see in Sweden. They're ensuring immigration stays manageable and integration remains possible. Whether these policies will achieve those goals, or whether they represent a betrayal of Norway's humanitarian values, remains hotly debated. What's undeniable is that Norway is no longer the outlier. It's firmly in step with a broader European trend toward closed borders and conditional welcomes. The era of easy immigration is over, and Norway, once a beacon of generosity, is now openly prioritizing self-preservation over asylum. In January 2025, Erna Solberg captured the mood perfectly. The next 20 years cannot be a copy of the last 20 years. Translation: the doors are closing, fast and with a firm hand, and they're not opening again anytime soon. What about why France is suddenly declaring war on immigration?